Let's talk about 9 players that you need to be starting in week 12 of fantasy football. As always, we're going to break this up into 3 different categories: your smash starts, your solid starts, and your high risk, high reward starts. If you do end up enjoying the video, consider leaving a like. Make sure you are subscribed. And if you have a start sit question, feel free to leave it down in the comment section. I will answer it. All right, let's start with our high risk, high reward category. First guy up on the list is Kenneth Gainwell. If you spent all your fab, your number one waiver priority to get Gainwell on your roster, then you are starting him this week. We know there's a lot of question marks on this offense. Is Jaylen Warren going to play? Is Aaron Rodgers going to play? I think regardless, Gainwell is a very strong start in week 12, and he showed up in big moments for the Steelers when given the opportunity. He went off last week, 9 carries, 24 yards, 2.7 yards per carry. You obviously don't love that, but 7 receptions, 81 yards, 2 touchdowns on 8 targets, 29.5 fantasy points. And in 2 games where Gainwell was the only guy or the only running back that they really used in Pittsburgh's backfield, he's produced RB1 numbers in fantasy. Obviously last week, and then if you remember in week 4 against the Vikings, he racked up 2 touchdowns and 31.4 fantasy points. Ideally, we'd like Aaron Rodgers to be active in this one, because if he's out, then the whole nature of this offense does take a hit. He's dealing with that small fracture in his non-throwing hand. He's pushing to play. I do think Rodgers does end up playing. It could result in more checkdowns for Gainwell out of the backfield, which we would like. If Warren is out, I think Gainwell is a solid start. And if Jaylen plays, I think Kenny is a little more risky, but I still think you can throw him in your flex against a very beatable Chicago Bears defense that's allowing 20 fantasy points per game to running backs this season. All right, moving on to our next guy, Ricky Pearsall, who finally returned to action last week after missing the last 6 games with that PCL injury. And while he didn't do much of anything, it was his first game back in a while. He had a catch for 0 yards, 3 targets. He did tie for the team lead in wide receiver snaps with Juwan Jennings at 75%. So that's a good overall sign, right? That tells us that Slick Rick is finally feeling close to 100%. He's back to full health, and I think he gets back to his dominant ways the second half of the year. If you remember, to start the season, Pearsall was looking like he was going to have a monster breakout year, as he was averaging 90 receiving yards and 14.6 fantasy points per game before injuring his knee. And then obviously he didn't do much last week, but I would be keeping the faith with Ricky. I do feel comfortable starting him this week. It does help that Brock Purdy is also back from injury. He looked incredible in his first game, returning with that toe foot injury. It looked like Brock had literally no rust out there. And while I do think Juwan Jennings is a nice player overall, Pearsall is the wide receiver 1 on this roster. He is by far the superior talent, and I think he goes nuts on Monday Night Football against the Panthers, who have allowed back-to-back 100-yard games to Drake London and Chris Olave. I'd also be trying to trade for Pearsall. Buy low on him now if your trade deadline has not passed yet, because the 49ers have a great playoff schedule. Again, he's in the high-risk, high-reward category, but I think a lot of people are fading him, and I think it's going to be a mistake. If he's on your roster, I would be starting him. All right, moving on to our next guy, Kenneth Walker. It's been a terribly frustrating season for the ultra-talented back. It just feels like this coaching staff just hates Kenneth Walker at this point. Like, it's all I can think of. I remember a couple weeks ago on Walker's birthday, they subbed him out on the goal line to give Zach Charbonnet the 1-yard score. Like, he can't even give the birthday boy a touchdown. I don't think Charbonnet is that superior of a goal line back. I really don't understand it. It's been unreal. It's been frustrating, but they might be turning a corner, as Seattle's head coach came out recently and said Walker is earning more opportunities to touch the football. I sure hope so, because he's coming off his best game of the season in week 11, 16 carries, 67 yards, a touchdown, 4.2 yards per carry. He chipped in 3 receptions for 44 yards, 20.1 fantasy points. He also had another touchdown that was called back on holding or illegal formation or whatever it was. So he should have had 2 scores in this game. And that was Walker's first touchdown since week 3. That is absolutely brutal, but Seattle finally might be realizing something we've all seen this entire time, that Walker is the more explosive, better back than Zach Charbonnet at this point. And I get it, starting Kenneth on a weekly basis at this point, like you probably just feel better putting him on your bench because there is a lot of risk involved. But coming off a nice performance, the coaching staff is kind of praising him finally, and the matchup is great against the Titans, who are allowing the 5th most fantasy points to running backs and have given up 16 plus fantasy points to 6 running backs since week 3, and are also allowing nearly 5 yards per carry. I think this feels like another blow up spot for Walker in week 12. All right, moving on to our solid starts. First guy up on the list is Michael Wilson, who we all know at this point went absolutely crazy in week 11 with no Marvin Harrison, 15 receptions, 185 yards, 18 targets, the most receiving yards by any player in a game this season. Far and away, Wilson's best game of his young career, 33.5 fantasy points, 31% target share. Now, it is worth noting that Jacoby Brissett set an NFL record for the most completions in a regular season game at 47. He also threw for 452 yards. So this volume, right, for Wilson is not going to be a weekly occurrence. He's not going to see 18 targets in every game, but Marvin is set to miss his 2nd straight game with appendicitis, which means Wilson is going to be the wide receiver 1 on this team, probably number 2 in targets behind Trey McBride, who's playing out of his mind this year. And I think Wilson goes off again in week 12. He gets the Jaguars, who since week 6 have allowed the most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers. If you added Michael off the waiver wire, you can start him with a ton of confidence this week. He's not going to have 15 receptions, but I think he has a strong chance to find the end zone in this one. All right, moving on to our next guy, Woody Marks, who was a massive disappointment last week in a smash spot against the Titans. 18 carries, 44 yards, 2.4 yards per carry, 1 reception, 7 yards, 6.1 fantasy points. There's not a lot you can hang your hat on here, but this was the 2nd straight week where Woody saw very nice usage and appears to be the workhorse back for the Texans moving forward. I think they're kind of done with Nick Chubb at this point, as Marks has accounted for 72% of the snaps and 78% of the rush attempts over the last 2 weeks. So brutal performance, but you do like to see that type of volume, that type of usage. Marks has averaged 14.6 touches per game in his last 5 outings and has scored 12 plus fantasy points in 3 of those games. I would keep the faith in the rookie running back because the matchup this week is just too good to pass up on, as the Bills have allowed the 5th most rushing yards and most rushing touchdowns to running backs this season, along with allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the position. It would not shock me at all if Marks is utilized more as a receiver in this game. They could be trailing the Buffalo Bills in this contest, which will force them to throw the football. I do think Marks is very startable. We've seen this Buffalo Bills defense get gashed as of late. We saw Sean Tucker shred them last week. I think the week before that, Devon Achane also went off. So it's been frustrating with Woody. He's been okay. He just has those big blow-up games, and then he kind of comes down to earth. I do think Marks has a very strong performance in week 12. All right, moving on to our next guy, Chris Olave, who I think is going to close out the year on an absolute tear for the Saints. And he balled out in week 10 before their bye. 5 receptions, 104 yards, a touchdown, 8 targets, 21.4 fantasy points. And it was super encouraging to see a game like that because his first game with rookie Tyler Shuck under center was like, oh no, where's Spencer Rattler? Like, it was horrible. But this last performance makes me feel a lot more comfortable. And the rookie quarterback did look very poised, pretty efficient in his 2nd career start, which I think is going to bode well for Olave the rest of the season. We know the talent from Chris, right? I think he's one of the most talented receivers in the league, and he's benefited from this very wide receiver friendly scheme that Kellen Moore has implemented in this offense in year 1. He's utilized Olave all over the formation, all over the field, putting him in the slot, outside, just moving him around, something that he didn't see a lot of his first couple years in New Orleans. I think Olave is going to continue to thrive on this offense that is going to be trailing in most games, so they're going to have to throw the football. And who do they have in this wide receiver room? Like, Rashid Shaheed is a Seattle Seahawk. Brandon Cooks just asked to be released because they're not utilizing him at all. Like, it's literally Chris Olave through the air. I think he's going to see crazy volume on a weekly basis, and he's a must-start player for the rest of the season. Gets a very favorable matchup in week 12 against the Falcons, who have allowed the second most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers over the last 4 weeks. I think a massive week is coming yet again for Olave. Make sure he is locked into your starting lineup. Let's move to the smash starts section of the video. First guy up on the list is TreVeyon Henderson, who is finally producing for fantasy football. It only took 10 weeks for him to do so, but we will take it at this point. Henderson has been nothing short of spectacular over his last 2 games. Week 10, 28 fantasy points. Week 11, 32.3 fantasy points. He's averaging 24.3 fantasy points in 3 starts this year. And over that 3-week span, Henderson ranks first in rushing touchdowns, third in yards after contact per attempt, fifth in rushing yards. And obviously a lot of Henderson's success as of late has been because Ramondre Stevenson, who this coaching staff absolutely loves, has not been playing. He's nursing a toe foot injury, and he could be back this week, which would obviously take a hit to TreVeyon's overall workload, overall usage. But I do think regardless, he has earned a larger role on this offense. Like, there's no way that they just slide him back over to the bench and insert Ramondre Stevenson. TreVeyon is just clearly the more talented, versatile back at this point. And Stevenson hasn't been very special at all this year. He's averaging 3.4 yards per carry, which is second worst among running backs. I think you can be starting TreVeyon in week 12, regardless if Stevenson returns or not, because the matchup is just way too good to pass up on against the Cincinnati Bengals, who we all know at this point are a horrible run defense. They've allowed the most rushing yards and fantasy points per game to running backs this season. So obviously we would like Stevenson to rest a little longer, but it will be interesting to see what this split looks like. I will be livid if TreVeyon sees 5 touches this week. I just think that's not possible. I think you start Henderson regardless and just pray that this coaching staff has finally come to their senses. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jameson Williams. It's been a whole new world for Jamo since Dan Campbell took over as the play caller in week 10. 7 targets and 19 plus fantasy points in each of Williams' last 2 games, a touchdown in 3 straight games. And what we're seeing right now was the Williams that I was talking up all summer. This is what we thought we were going to see from week 1, not starting in week 10, right? That's why I was so high on Jamo this offseason, because this is what we were promised, a larger role, a bigger part of the offense, and we're finally seeing it. It's nice to see Detroit finally realizing, oh yeah, maybe we should use one of our best players on offense. And it's honestly been the perfect storm for Williams as of late. The increased usage and Sam Laporta, star tight end, suffering a back injury, going on IR has also opened up the field for Williams. Maybe they wouldn't have come to their senses if Laporta didn't get hurt. Maybe Jameson would not be seeing this type of role if Laporta was active, but hey, we're going to take it. And I'm expecting Williams to stay hot in week 12 against a horrible Giants secondary that's allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to receivers, along with the 4th most yards. Detroit is also coming off that brutal loss to the Eagles. They're going to be angry, and I just think they're going to run up the score against the Giants. It just feels like one of those games where Detroit scores 35 plus points on offense, and I think Jameson is going to be a big part of it. All right, moving on to our next guy, Tedoroa McMillan, who's coming off by far the best game of his rookie year in week 11, 8 receptions, 130 yards, 2 touchdowns, 12 targets. All those numbers are career highs, 33 fantasy points. And T-Mac also saw a season high in slot usage, which is extremely smart. I'm excited that this coaching staff is finally realizing, yeah, give your best player on offense those easy layup targets out of the slot. I think that is a brilliant idea. And if that continues, that is something that could completely unlock McMillan for the rest of the year. He could be a monster the second half of the season. And we see it all the time, right? These rookie receivers go crazy the back half of the year. We saw it with Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey last year. It would not shock me at all if McMillan is on a similar path. It's never been a question of talent, as the former 8th overall pick is an absolute baller. I think he's looking like he's going to be one of the best receivers in all of football in a couple years. It's been Bryce Young, who struggled for most of the year, but he was playing at an elite level in week 11, 448 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 68.9% completion percentage. I honestly think Bryce could have a field day in week 12 against the San Francisco 49ers defense that we just talked about. Got shredded by Jacoby Brissett through the air. He threw for 452 yards. Like, why can Young not go off against this same defense? I think he absolutely can. And if he does, it's going to result in another big T-Mac game, who also has a very favorable matchup through the air, as the 49ers have allowed the 3rd most yards to receivers this season, along with the 9th most fantasy points per game. Expect Tataroa to smash yet again. That's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate each and every one of you watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.